The sun was setting beyond the endless forests of early America. Long shadows stretched across rough dirt paths where horses pulled wooden wagons through a land that was still wild and untamed. Small cabins stood alone among towering oak and walnut trees, surrounded by fields carved out of dense wilderness with little more than axes and determination. Life here was not easy. Every meal depended on hard work. Every winter tested the strength of a family. There were no electric lights, no paved roads, no hospitals nearby, and very few schools. Most children spent their days helping their parents survive rather than sitting inside classrooms. Yet from this harsh frontier, where poverty was simply a way of life, a quiet child was growing into someone history would never forget. His name was Abraham Lincoln. He was not born into wealth or power. No one expected him to become famous. There were no signs that this thin, shy farm boy would one day guide an entire nation through its darkest chapter. But sometimes the greatest stories begin in the smallest places. This is the remarkable journey of Abraham Lincoln, a boy who owned almost nothing except an endless curiosity, a young man who educated himself with borrowed books, and a leader whose courage forever changed the history of the United States. As our story unfolds, imagine yourself stepping back more than 200 years into a young America still searching for its identity. Listen to the quiet sounds of the forests, the crackling fire inside a wooden cabin, and the gentle turning of old book pages beneath the glow of a single candle. This is where the story truly begins. On February 12, 1809, Abraham Lincoln entered the world inside a tiny log cabin near Hogganville, Kentucky. The cabin was simple, built from rough-cut logs with cracks that allowed cold winter winds to slip inside. The dirt floor became muddy whenever rain found its way through the roof. There was only one room where the entire family slept, cooked, and lived together. Compared to the grand homes of wealthy landowners, it seemed almost invisible. Yet within these humble walls, history quietly took its first breath. His father, Thomas Lincoln, worked as a farmer and carpenter. Strong and hard-working, Thomas spent long days clearing forests and planting crops, hoping each harvest would provide enough food to keep his family alive through another winter. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, possessed a gentle spirit that balanced the hardships surrounding them. She believed kindness mattered more than riches and that honesty was worth more than gold. She often reminded young Abraham that a person's true wealth could never be measured by land or money, but by the goodness within their heart. Those lessons would stay with him forever. Life on the American frontier demanded strength from everyone, even children. By the time Abraham could carry a bucket, he helped fetch water from nearby streams. As he grew older, he gathered firewood, cared for farm animals, planted crops, repaired fences, and assisted his father wherever he could. The work was exhausting. From sunrise until sunset, every member of the family shared the burden of survival. Yet even after long days filled with physical labor, Abraham's greatest hunger was not for food, it was for knowledge. Books were incredibly rare on the frontier. Many families owned only of the Bible. Schools existed only in scattered settlements, and even those remained open for just a few weeks each year. Teachers often traveled from village to village, staying only until the weather or finances forced them elsewhere. For most children, education ended almost before it began, but Abraham refused to let that stop him. Whenever he heard that someone living miles away owned a book, he eagerly walked through forests and muddy trails simply for the chance to borrow it. Sometimes those journeys lasted hours. Every borrowed page became a priceless treasure. As evening arrived and darkness settled across Kentucky, the Lincoln cabin grew quiet. The family gathered around the fireplace after another difficult day. The only light came from dancing flames or a small candle that flickered against the wooden walls. While others rested, Abraham opened another borrowed book. He read slowly, carefully. Every sentence mattered. He was not simply reading words, he was discovering entirely new worlds. History introduced him to remarkable leaders who shaped civilizations. Stories of courage taught him that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things. The Bible filled him with moral questions about justice, mercy, and compassion. Sometimes there was no paper available for writing. Instead, Abraham solved mathematics problems by scratching numbers onto flat wooden boards with pieces of charcoal. When even those boards became full, He simply wiped them clean and began again. Nothing discouraged him. Knowledge had become his greatest adventure. As neighbors watched the unusually tall boy reading whenever he found a spare moment, many wondered why he spent so much time with books instead of focusing entirely on farm work. They could not imagine that those quiet evenings would one day help shape the future of an entire nation. But Abraham himself did not yet know where life would lead. He simply loved learning, and that simple love would become the foundation of everything that followed. In the years ahead, life would test him in ways no child should ever experience. A journey into a new wilderness awaited, a heartbreaking loss would leave scars that never fully healed, and one extraordinary woman would step into his life at exactly the moment he needed hope the most. The forests of southern Indiana stretched endlessly beneath gray autumn skies. Towering trees surrounded the Lincoln family's new home, and the silence of the wilderness was broken only by birdsong, the chopping of axes, and the distant sound of rushing streams. In 1816, when Abraham was just 7 years old, his family left Kentucky behind and traveled north into Indiana. The journey was long and dangerous. There were no smooth roads, no bridges over many rivers, and no comfortable wagons carrying families safely across the frontier. Every mile demanded patience and courage. Thick forests had to be crossed, muddy trails had to be followed, and the family carried with them only the possessions they could fit into their wagon. When they finally arrived, they found not a town waiting to welcome them, but untouched wilderness. Everything had to be built from the ground up. Thomas Lincoln immediately began cutting down trees to construct another small log cabin. Together, the family cleared land for farming, planted crops, and struggled to create a new beginning. For young Abraham, the move was both exciting and exhausting. The endless forests became his playground during rare moments of rest, but they also reminded him how isolated life truly was. Books were even harder to find. Schools were almost non-existent. Yet his desire to learn only grew stronger. Whenever traveling preachers, merchants, or neighbors visited, Abraham listened carefully to every conversation. He asked questions about places he had never seen, people he had never met, and ideas he had never imagined. His curiosity seemed impossible to satisfy. But while hope was slowly returning to the Lincoln family, tragedy was quietly approaching. In the autumn of 1818, a mysterious illness spread across the Indiana frontier. Today historians know it as milk sickness. At the time, no one understood its cause. Cows grazed on a poisonous wild plant called white snake root. The poison passed into their milk, and families who drank it became dangerously ill. Many settlers died without ever knowing why. Among them was Abraham's beloved mother. Nancy Hanks Lincoln grew weaker with each passing day. The once energetic woman who had encouraged kindness and honesty could barely stand. Young Abraham watched helplessly beside her bed. There were no doctors nearby, no hospitals, no medicine, only hope, and slowly, even hope disappeared. On October 5, 1818, Nancy Hanks Lincoln died. Abraham was only 9 years old. The small cabin that had once been filled with warmth suddenly felt empty. Silence replaced laughter. The gentle voice that had told him stories and encouraged him to read was gone forever. The family buried Nancy on a quiet hillside near their home. There was no elaborate funeral, no grand monument, only a simple wooden marker surrounded by the peaceful forests she had loved. For Abraham, the loss changed everything. Years later, he would still speak of his mother with deep respect and gratitude. He once said that everything he hoped to become, he owed to her. Those words revealed just how deeply her influence had shaped his character. Without his mother's guidance, life became much harder. Thomas Lincoln struggled to care for his children while managing the farm alone. The cabin felt incomplete. The children missed the comfort only a mother could provide. Recognizing that his family needed help, Thomas made another long journey back to Kentucky. When he returned several months later, he was not alone. With him came Sarah Bush Johnston. Sarah was a widow with 3 children of her own. She entered the Lincoln cabin carrying furniture, blankets, kitchen supplies, and something even more valuable. She brought compassion. From the very beginning, Sarah treated Abraham and his sister as if they were her own children. She noticed immediately that Abraham was different. While other boys rushed outside whenever work ended, Abraham searched for books. When others talked about farming, Abraham asked questions about history, government, and the wider world. Many adults dismissed these interests as impractical. Sarah did not. Instead, she encouraged them. She urged Thomas to allow Abraham time to study after completing his chores. Whenever she found books, she brought them home. She praised his curiosity instead of criticizing it. Years later, Abraham would lovingly describe Sarah as the best friend he ever had. Her belief in him arrived exactly when he needed it most. The lonely boy who had lost his mother slowly regained confidence. Although his formal education remained extremely limited, amounting to less than a year altogether, his true classroom became the frontier itself. Every borrowed book became another teacher. He devoured biographies of famous leaders, books about American history, stories from ancient civilizations, and passages from the Bible that challenged him to think deeply about justice, mercy, and human dignity. He didn't simply memorize facts, he questioned everything. Neighbors often found him reading while resting beneath large trees after finishing his chores. Sometimes he walked several miles just to borrow a single book. When he finished reading it, he carefully returned it before searching for another. Each new volume expanded his understanding of the world. Paper remained expensive, so Abraham invented his own methods of learning. He practiced arithmetic by writing numbers with charcoal on wooden shingles. He copied passages onto smooth boards. If no writing surface was available, he traced letters into the dirt using sticks. Nothing prevented him from learning. His determination impressed nearly everyone who knew him. As he entered his teenage years, Abraham experienced another remarkable transformation. He grew taller, much taller. By adulthood, he would stand 6 feet 4 inches tall, making him one of the tallest presidents in American history. His long arms and powerful frame came from years of splitting rails, chopping wood, and working the farm. Despite his unusual appearance, Abraham never sought attention. He remained quiet, thoughtful, and humble. Yet beneath that calm exterior, something extraordinary was taking shape. The lonely frontier boy was becoming a young man guided by knowledge, compassion, and an unshakable belief that education could change a person's destiny. Soon, another journey would carry him beyond the forests of Indiana. Along the mighty Mississippi River, Abraham would witness a terrible injustice that would haunt him for the rest of his life and plant the seeds of a mission that would one day transform America forever. As Abraham Lincoln entered his 20s, the quiet forests of Indiana could no longer contain his growing dreams. The books he had borrowed from neighbors had opened windows into distant places. The stories of great leaders, brave explorers, and lawmakers had awakened something deep inside him. Although he respected the hard work of farming, he sensed that his future lay somewhere beyond the endless rows of cornfields and towering oak trees. America itself was changing. New towns were appearing along rivers. Trade was expanding westward. Steamboats carried people and goods across thousands of miles, connecting communities that had once been isolated. The young nation was growing rapidly, filled with opportunity but also burdened by deep divisions that threatened its future. Abraham longed to see that wider world with his own eyes. In 1828, while still a young man, he accepted an opportunity that would become one of the most important experiences of his life. He joined a flatboat journey down the mighty Mississippi River. The flatboat was simple, built from heavy timber and designed to carry crops and supplies downstream. It drifted with the current, stopping at busy river towns where merchants bought and sold goods arriving from every corner of America. For Abraham, every mile was a lesson. He watched bustling ports filled with traders speaking different languages. He saw cities much larger than anything he had imagined growing up on the frontier. He met travelers whose lives were completely different from his own. Each new place expanded his understanding of the country, but nothing prepared him for what awaited him in New Orleans. The city was alive with activity. Horse-drawn wagons rolled through crowded streets. Ships from Europe, the Caribbean, and South America filled the harbor. Markets overflowed with spices, cotton, sugar, and goods from distant lands. Yet beneath the city's prosperity lay a heartbreaking reality. Abraham witnessed one of the largest slave markets in the United States. Men, women, and children stood together in public squares as buyers inspected them like livestock. Families were separated without mercy. Parents cried as their children were taken away. Young mothers reached desperately for babies they would never see again. Human beings were bought and sold simply because of the color of their skin. The sounds of the marketplace remained with Abraham long after he left. He saw fear in the eyes of those whose freedom had been stolen. He saw despair where hope should have lived. Although he spoke little about that day, many historians believe the experience left a permanent mark on his conscience. Years later, friends recalled that Lincoln often reflected on slavery with deep sadness. Whether in that exact moment or gradually over time, one truth became clear to him: no human being should ever be treated as property. The journey home was quiet. The Mississippi continued flowing northward just as it always had. But Abraham himself had changed. He returned carrying more than memories. He returned carrying a question that would shape the rest of his life. How could a nation built upon the promise of liberty allow millions to live without freedom? It was a question America itself would eventually have to answer. In 1830, the Lincoln family moved once again. This time, they settled in Illinois, a young state filled with growing communities and new opportunities. For Abraham, the move represented more than another change of home. It was the beginning of independence. Soon after arriving, he chose to build his own future rather than remain on the family farm. He accepted whatever honest work he could find. He split rails to build fences, earning the nickname the rail splitter. The work demanded incredible strength. Hour after hour, he swung a heavy axe, cutting massive logs into long wooden rails used by settlers across the frontier. His towering height and powerful arms made him exceptionally skilled. But people noticed something else about him. Despite the exhausting labor, Abraham always carried himself with kindness. He greeted strangers politely. He listened more than he spoke, and whenever disagreements arose, he often settled them with calm reasoning instead of anger. His reputation spread quickly. People trusted him. They believed his word. Before long, Abraham found work in a small village called New Salem. The community was little more than a cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by open prairie. Here, he worked as a store clerk, postmaster, surveyor, and laborer. No job seemed beneath him, whether delivering letters or measuring farmland. He completed every task with remarkable honesty. One famous story from this period became part of American legend. After closing his small store one evening, Abraham realized he had accidentally charged a customer a few cents too much. Instead of waiting until the next day, he walked several miles through darkness simply to return the money. Another time, he discovered he had given someone too little tea by mistake. Again, he traveled to correct the error. These were small amounts. Few people would have noticed, but Abraham believed integrity was measured by the smallest actions. The people of New Salem began calling him Honest Abe. It was not a title he sought. It was one he earned. His evenings looked very different from those of many other young men. While friends gathered for entertainment, Abraham sat beside the fireplace reading borrowed books. Law fascinated him. Government fascinated him even more. He wanted to understand why societies succeeded or failed, why justice mattered, how ordinary citizens could improve their communities. Without attending a university, he began teaching himself law. He borrowed every legal book he could find. Each page demanded careful attention. Legal language was difficult. The principles were complex. But Abraham welcomed the challenge. He studied late into the night, often reading until the fire burned low and the room fell silent. Years of self-discipline slowly transformed the farm boy into a man prepared for a profession few believed possible. When he finally passed the bar examination and became a licensed lawyer, many were amazed. The young man with almost no formal education had achieved what many wealthier men never could. As a lawyer traveling across Illinois on horseback, Abraham became known for fairness rather than clever tricks. He refused dishonest cases. If he believed a client was guilty or lying, he encouraged them to settle rather than deceive the court. His goal was not simply to win. His goal was to seek justice. That principle earned him enormous respect. Courtrooms across Illinois became the stage where Abraham sharpened another extraordinary gift, his ability to speak. He did not use complicated language. He spoke simply, clearly. Every story, every example, every sentence helped ordinary people understand difficult ideas. Soon crowds gathered not only to hear his legal arguments but simply to listen to him speak. Few realized those speeches were preparing him for an even greater role. Beyond Illinois, the United States was becoming increasingly divided. Arguments over slavery grew louder with each passing year. North and South stood further apart than ever before. A storm was approaching, and before long, the quiet lawyer from Illinois would find himself standing at the very center of the greatest crisis in American history. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States stood at a dangerous crossroads. The nation had grown from a collection of small colonies into a powerful republic stretching from the Atlantic Ocean toward the Pacific. New cities were rising, railroads connected distant communities, and factories were transforming the economy. Yet beneath this remarkable progress, a deep wound continued to divide the country. It was the question of slavery. For decades, politicians had argued over whether slavery should spread into new American territories. Northern states increasingly opposed the practice, while many Southern states believed their economy depended upon it. Every new state admitted to the Union threatened to upset the fragile balance between free and slave states. The tension grew stronger each year. Families argued. Churches divided. Newspapers filled their pages with angry debates. Many feared that the United States itself might not survive. In Illinois, Abraham Lincoln watched these events with growing concern. He believed the nation could not remain united forever if it accepted two completely different ideas about human freedom. In 1858, Lincoln challenged one of the country's most influential politicians, Senator Stephen A. Douglas, in a campaign that would become famous throughout American history. Although the election was for a Senate seat, it felt much larger. Across Illinois, enormous crowds gathered to hear the two men debate. Farmers left their fields. Merchants closed their shops. Families traveled for hours in wagons simply to witness the historic discussions. Lincoln spoke with calm confidence. His voice was never filled with hatred. Instead, he appealed to reason. He argued that slavery was morally wrong and warned that America could not continue forever divided between freedom and bondage. During one speech, he spoke words that echoed across the nation: "A house divided against itself cannot stand." The sentence was simple, yet its meaning was powerful. Lincoln believed the United States would eventually become entirely free or entirely enslaved. There could be no permanent middle ground. Although he lost the Senate election, something unexpected happened. His speeches spread across newspapers throughout the country. Millions of Americans who had never heard his name before suddenly recognized the thoughtful lawyer from Illinois. Without winning the election, Abraham Lincoln had won something even greater: the attention of an entire nation. 2 years later, in 1860, leaders of the newly formed Republican Party gathered in Chicago to choose their candidate for president. Many expected a famous politician to receive the nomination. Instead, they selected Abraham Lincoln. For the humble lawyer from Illinois, it was an extraordinary moment. He had begun life inside a tiny log cabin with almost no formal education. Now he stood as a candidate for the highest office in the United States. His campaign focused on preserving the Union and preventing the expansion of slavery. He spoke respectfully, avoided personal attacks, and encouraged Americans to remain united despite their differences. On November 6, 1860, the votes were counted. Abraham Lincoln had been elected the 16th President of the United States. Celebrations erupted across much of the North, but in many Southern states, fear and anger spread rapidly. Even before Lincoln took office, several Southern states announced they would leave the Union. They formed a new government known as the Confederate States of America. The nation Lincoln had promised to protect was already beginning to break apart. When he arrived in Washington, D.C., in March 1861, the atmosphere was tense. Armed guards watched the streets. Rumors of assassination circulated everywhere. The young republic faced the greatest crisis in its history. Only weeks after Lincoln became president, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. It would become the bloodiest conflict America had ever experienced. For the next 4 years, the nation lived in constant sorrow. Fields that once produced crops became battlefields. Peaceful towns echoed with cannon fire. Families waited anxiously for letters from sons and fathers serving far from home. More than 600,000 soldiers would lose their lives. Lincoln carried that burden every single day. Visitors often noticed how dramatically he changed during the war. The cheerful lawyer who once entertained friends with humorous stories now looked exhausted. Deep lines appeared across his face. His hair turned gray. Sleepless nights became common. Every decision meant that more young Americans might never return home. Yet despite the enormous pressure, Lincoln refused to surrender to despair. He believed the Union must survive, not for politics, not for power, but because democracy itself depended upon it. If a government chosen by its people could simply fall apart whenever disagreements became difficult, what hope would democracy have anywhere in the world? Then, in 1863, Lincoln made one of the most courageous decisions of his presidency. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The document declared that enslaved people living in Confederate-controlled territory were forever free. Although it did not immediately end slavery everywhere, it transformed the purpose of the war. The struggle was no longer only about preserving the Union. It had become a fight for human freedom. Across the world, people watched with hope. Millions who had never met Abraham Lincoln now saw him as a symbol of justice. Later that same year, another defining moment arrived. In the quiet town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, one of the Civil War's deadliest battles had left thousands of soldiers buried beneath the rolling hills. A ceremony was organized to dedicate a national cemetery. Many expected the main speaker to deliver the speech everyone would remember. Instead, history chose another voice. After a long address by another speaker, President Lincoln stood. He spoke for barely 2 minutes, just 272 carefully chosen words, yet those few words became one of the greatest speeches ever delivered. He reminded Americans that all people are created equal. He honored those who had given their lives, and he challenged the living to continue the unfinished work of building a nation dedicated to liberty and democracy. Today, the Gettysburg Address is studied around the world, and not because it was long, but because every sentence carried extraordinary meaning. As the war entered its final months, victory slowly came into view. Confederate armies surrendered. The Union had survived. Soon afterward, the 13th Amendment permanently abolished slavery throughout the United States. The dream Abraham Lincoln had quietly carried since witnessing the slave markets of New Orleans was becoming reality. Millions of men, women, and children were finally free. The long and painful struggle had changed the nation forever, yet Lincoln did not celebrate with pride. Instead, he spoke about healing. He urged Americans to forgive one another. He believed lasting peace required compassion as much as victory. His famous words reflected the spirit that had guided his entire life, with malice toward none, with charity for all. After years of unimaginable suffering, he dreamed of rebuilding a united country. Sadly, he would never live to see that dream fulfilled. Just days after the Civil War ended, tragedy waited in the shadows. A single gunshot would silence one of history's greatest leaders, but his ideals would continue to inspire generations yet to come. In the spring of 1865, a quiet sense of hope began to return to America. After 4 long years of war, the thunder of cannons was finally fading. Across the countryside, soldiers who had survived the terrible conflict started their long journeys home. Families who had spent years fearing the arrival of heartbreaking letters now waited at their doors with hope instead of despair. For the first time in years, the nation could imagine a future without war. President Abraham Lincoln shared that hope. The enormous burden he had carried since entering the White House had aged him beyond his years. His once dark hair had turned noticeably gray, and deep lines marked his face. Friends often remarked that he looked much older than his 56 years, yet behind the tired eyes remained the same gentle spirit that had guided him since childhood. He did not dream of revenge. He did not seek to punish those who had fought against the Union. Instead, he believed America could only become whole again through forgiveness, compassion, and reconciliation. Only a few weeks before his death, Lincoln delivered what would become his final public speech. Standing before a crowd gathered outside the White House, he spoke about rebuilding the nation and extending the promise of freedom to those who had only recently emerged from slavery. He believed that peace required more than military victory. It required justice. It required unity. It required the courage to move forward together. Many people listening that evening felt inspired. But hidden among the crowd was a man whose heart burned with hatred. His name was John Wilkes Booth. Booth was a famous stage actor, admired for his performances in theaters across America. Yet beneath his public success, he was fiercely loyal to the defeated Confederacy. He believed Lincoln had destroyed the South and could not accept the outcome of the Civil War. As the president spoke about healing the nation, Booth quietly began planning something that would shock the world. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Good Friday, Washington, D.C., seemed unusually peaceful. The streets were filled with celebration. Church bells rang, bands played music, and citizens embraced one another, relieved that the terrible war had finally ended. Friends encouraged the president to take a break from his exhausting responsibilities. Lincoln agreed. That evening, he and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, attended a comedy performance at Ford's Theater. The audience welcomed them with warm applause as they entered the presidential box overlooking the stage. For a brief moment, Abraham Lincoln appeared relaxed. He laughed, he smiled. Perhaps he imagined the difficult years ahead would finally be devoted to rebuilding rather than fighting. No one inside the theater realized they were witnessing the final peaceful moments of his life. Shortly after 10 o'clock, John Wilkes Booth quietly entered the theater. Knowing the building well because of his acting career, he easily reached the presidential box. The play continued. The audience laughed at a humorous line. At that exact moment, Booth stepped behind the president and fired a single pistol shot. The sound echoed through the theater. For an instant, many people believed it was part of the performance. Then panic spread. Booth leaped from the balcony onto the stage below. Although he injured his leg during the jump, he managed to escape into the night. Doctors rushed to Lincoln's side. The wound was devastating. There was nothing they could do. The president was carefully carried across the street to a modest boarding house known as the Peterson House. There, surrounded by members of his cabinet, military officers, close friends, and his grieving wife, Abraham Lincoln lay unconscious through the long night. The room was silent except for whispered prayers. Outside, thousands of anxious citizens gathered in the streets, hoping for a miracle. But as dawn approached, it became clear that America's beloved president would never awaken. At 7:22 on the morning of April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton looked at the peaceful face of the fallen president and quietly spoke words that history would never forget. Now he belongs to the ages. News of Lincoln's death spread across the nation with astonishing speed. Church bells rang in mourning. Businesses closed their doors. Black cloth covered government buildings. People gathered in silence, unable to believe that the man who had guided America through its darkest years was gone. Many openly wept. Some had never met him. Others had once criticized his decisions during the war. But now the nation recognized what it had lost. A leader who had carried extraordinary responsibility without surrendering his humanity. Lincoln's funeral became one of the largest public memorials in American history. His body traveled by train from Washington, D.C., back to Springfield, Illinois, the town where his political career had begun. The funeral train passed through hundreds of cities and towns. Millions of Americans stood quietly beside railroad tracks as it rolled past. Some removed their hats. Others knelt in prayer. Children climbed onto fences just to catch a final glimpse of the train carrying their president home. It was a journey unlike any the nation had ever witnessed. Finally, Abraham Lincoln was laid to rest in Springfield, surrounded by the people and the state that had helped shape his remarkable life. Yet Lincoln's story did not end with his funeral. In many ways, it had only just begun. Historians continue to study his leadership. Political scientists examine the wisdom of his decisions during the Civil War. Psychologists explore how he endured unimaginable personal grief while carrying the weight of an entire nation. His speeches remain among the most carefully analyzed works in American history. Modern technology has revealed fascinating details about his life. Advanced forensic studies of photographs have helped historians understand how years of stress visibly transformed his appearance during the war. Thousands of preserved letters, legal documents, and handwritten notes provide remarkable insight into the way he thought and made decisions. His home in Springfield, the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., Ford's Theater, and the humble log cabin where his journey began have all become treasured historical landmarks. carefully preserved for future generations. These places remind visitors that greatness does not always begin in grand palaces or wealthy families. Sometimes it begins in a one-room cabin deep within the wilderness. Over the years, many legends have grown around Abraham Lincoln. Some claim he predicted his own death after describing a mysterious dream in which he wandered through the White House and discovered mourners gathered around the body of a fallen president. Whether the story is entirely true remains uncertain. Like many historical mysteries, it continues to fascinate scholars and storytellers alike. Another enduring mystery concerns Lincoln himself. What made him so resilient? How did a boy who experienced poverty, loss, repeated political failures, and unimaginable national tragedy continue moving forward without losing compassion? Perhaps the answer lies not in extraordinary talent, but in extraordinary character. He believed that learning never ends. He believed honesty matters, even when no one is watching. He believed every human being deserves dignity and freedom. Those simple principles shaped every chapter of his remarkable life. Today, more than 160 years after his death, Abraham Lincoln remains one of the most admired leaders in history. His words continue to inspire presidents, teachers, students, and ordinary people across the world. His journey reminds us that the place where we begin does not determine where we can go. A poor boy reading borrowed books by candlelight became the leader of a nation. A self-taught lawyer became the defender of democracy. A humble man changed the course of history not through wealth or privilege, but through wisdom, perseverance, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson Lincoln leaves behind. History is not shaped only by kings, generals, or those born into greatness. Sometimes, it is shaped by quiet dreamers who refuse to stop learning, by ordinary people who choose kindness over hatred, by individuals who stand for what is right, even when the cost is greater than they ever imagined. And somewhere, tonight, another young child may be sitting beneath a small light, turning the pages of a borrowed book, just as Abraham Lincoln once did. No one yet knows what that child may one day become, because history has a remarkable way of hiding extraordinary futures inside the most ordinary beginnings.